Hi, we are live with Inside Scoop with Sue and back again with Jess Lahey because today is launch day for her new book.
Yeah.
Yay. Well, hold it still so people can read it. Yay. The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence. So thank you for coming back with us. And
Oh,
we're
of course.
we are so excited about your book.
Thank you.
It's really, I mean, it's just such a fascinating read because the stories in it are woven with the data, and it's just really, it's a great book. So thank you for writing
Thank
it.
you.
Um,
It's funny because before we went live, you asked me if I was nervous, and I realized I'm actually more nervous today for the people whose stories I told. And it's always really scary to put your secrets out there into the world. And this book is very much memoir of me, but there's two people in particular, Brian and Georgia, that I am indebted to for their stories in this book. And I've just been thinking about them all morning and the fact that their stories are out there in the world. And they wanted to use their real names because they felt it was really, really important to make an impact for some other young adult out there who's struggling. And I'm so grateful to them.
can you give us like just a little bit about them?
Mhm. Sure. So Brian, I met because he started showing up in my kids' Facebook pictures, and they became friends at school, and they were on the cross country team together. And my son tells me about his friends, and so we've been talking about a lot of his friends. And then Brian disappeared from the pictures, and it turns out that Brian got kicked out of high school for drug and alcohol use. And my son, of course, that made me really nervous because research shows that peer cohort is a big risk factor for substance abuse. So if your kids' friends are using drugs and alcohol, the chances that your child will goes up. I've never, that I didn't think it was that quite black and white, but it led to a really interesting moment as a parent where I was really scared about letting my son be friends with this boy. And as we know as parents, the minute you say you can't be friends with this kid, that's a disaster waiting to happen. So we kept the communication flow open. And Ben understood our worries, but he said he thought it was really important to stick by Brian because they were a healthy influence on him, Ben and his friends, and that if Brian was going to make it, it was going to be because his friends supported him. And so I had to sort of gather up my mom fear and sort of push it down a little bit and just hope that this was true. And Brian actually got kicked out of high school more than once. It was a total of 3 times. And it wasn't until that third time that recovery really stuck for him. Georgia and he's doing great, by the way. He's doing fabulously
Yay.
well.
Yeah, that's great.
He actually wants to open his own rehab for kids. He's in college, and he's just amazing. Georgia actually was a student of mine when she was 15, and she dropped out of high school and just went down a really terrible path. She started drinking to mask her anxiety and to escape from her anxiety, her just crippling anxiety. And she was a daily drinker by the time I started teaching her in high school. And once she quit high school, things escalated really quickly. She moved in with her drug dealer boyfriend, and it just got worse and worse and worse. And she ended up in jail. She ended up losing custody of a child, deep in heroin addiction, homelessness, and finally got into recovery and had a relapse, and then got back into recovery and is doing fantastically well and is in a master's degree program. And she's just a brilliant, amazing, gorgeous human being. And I'm just so proud of them. Both of them felt like it was really important for people to hear their stories and know that there's hope, even if you end up homeless and shooting heroin and losing a child and all those things. There's a lot of reasons to think that there's no hope, but there is. So I'm
Okay, so
so
I
grateful
just
to
want
them
to
for those.
say thank you to both of them and that we are rooting for
Yeah.
their continued success because it is
Yeah.
really brave of them to share those stories.
I'm
So
so proud of them.
tell us why you wanted to write this book.
So I'm an alcoholic. I have this June, hopefully it will be 8 years of recovery. And
Yay.
yeah, I needed to get, so I really needed to get sober. It was And I was raised by in a family where there were alcoholics, sort of all over the place. And my husband has the same situation. So from a genetic perspective, once I got a handle on my own drinking, I started thinking, okay, so how do I help my kids avoid this? It looks like genetics are about 50 to 60% of the picture when it comes to substance use disorder. And then the other sort of 40% are things like, trauma and social ostracism and academic failure. And there are other kinds of risk factors that we have to start talking about at that point. So how do I help my kids who already have this elevated risk of substance use disorder? How do I protect them as much as possible? And I was also teaching in an inpatient rehab for adolescents. And I was seeing these kids and wanting to understand how they landed in my classroom. And the answers started to pile up, but I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't just sort of reacting to my anecdotal experience. So I spent a couple of years researching what the phrase substance abuse is preventable means, because that's the party line. And it's true, substance abuse is preventable, but it's a very complicated picture. And so I wanted to make it as simple as possible for parents.
Okay, so who should read it? What's the feedback you're getting from people?
Definitely parents is sort of the primary goal is to get parents to read it. But since we know that for kids who have experienced difficult things in their lives, if they have one adult rooting for them, one adult supporting them, one adult on their side, that they're a lot more likely to make it and have a successful life. So if you are that one person, if you're a mentor, pastor, coach, definitely coaches, there's a lot of stuff in here about sports and drinking. And teachers, there's an entire chapter on all the amazing things, effective, evidence-based things we could be doing in schools that we're not doing, because only 57% of schools in this country have any substance abuse prevention program. And of that 57%, only 10% of them are based on evidence. So we can be doing a lot better. And there are proven programs out there. And so I go through what those proven programs look like and why they work.
All right. So you talk about your job, teaching kids in recovery, and your passion, not just your job, but your love.
Yeah.
So over time, I'm sure you started to see that there were patterns that were appearing in your classroom.
Oh, yeah.
So tell us what some of those look like. What are the commonalities between these kids?
Well, I have to talk about that in response, or against the backdrop of the research, because my experience, yes, I've seen and taught, hundreds of kids in rehab, but that's still not a great sample size, whether it's because, I'm in New England, so most of the kids are white, I'm in Vermont, which is one of the whitest states in the country, all that kind of stuff. But yes, there were things I was seeing. There was almost always a kid with untreated attention, well, not just untreated, but attention hyperactivity disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Most of my students, there's a thing called an ACE score, Adverse Childhood Experiences, is wonderfully explained in a book called The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke-Harris. And essentially, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente did this huge survey looking at adults, looking at people and asking them what they dealt with in their childhood to see if that was predictive of disease later on in life, all kinds of adverse outcomes later on in life. And it turns out they are. So there's a list of 10, not really 10, but 10 categories of experiences that you may have had as a child. And the higher your score on that quiz, the more likely you are to have substance use disorder during your lifetime. And so it was fairly common for me to have kids in that classroom who were like anywhere from a 6 to a 10. And with each increasing number, your chances get higher and higher. It's a dose dependent kind of thing. So that's definitely a part of it. And
was there a most common of ACE? Was there a most common one or two that you saw in the classroom?
For the girls, it was childhood sexual abuse. And for the boys, it was a mix of a lot of things. We had a lot of kids coming from the foster care system, from group homes. A lot of them had experienced abuse at home. Almost all of them that had a substance abuse in the home growing up. that was definitely part of it. And that, that's that cross between the nature and nurture stuff. Like genetics aren't just about your genetics. Genetics also include this category called epigenetics, which is really how your environment causes your genes to express themselves. Like the world we live in, the home we live in, the way we're treated, that can, for better or for worse, it goes both ways, affect how our genes express in our bodies. And so that's a part of the picture as well. But for girls, definitely the childhood sexual abuse was one of the biggest risk factors. But again, the risk factors include things that are pretty common, like, divorce and separation and adoption. These are all really common things. And I don't mention them because I want anyone to feel like, oh, great, now I'm divorced. But like 50% of divorces, of first marriages end in divorce or separation. So what are we going to do? This is actually meant to my goal is to banish the shame and the guilt, to get rid of it. That's why I talk so blatantly and openly about my past, because I want people to feel empowered by this. I want people to say, okay, here's our situation. Here are the risk factors. Now, what are the protective factors and how do I start heaping them on kids? Because the more we know, the more we understand about our individual child and their individual risk level, the more we can sort of plan ahead for certain things that we're going to need to plan ahead for, like life transitions and summer and, those periods when kids are at higher risk than at other times. It's
and also,
important.
so you're not saying stay in a terrible marriage because that might be a factor.
No.
And it's also retrospective. So you're looking at kids who have an addiction issue, and of those kids, but there's many other kids who didn't become addicted who do have parents who are no longer married to them.
So what we're talking about in general is sort of, preventing substance abuse among everyone. But really what we're also trying to do is get kids to 18, because at 18, with each passing year, as kids are growing and their brains are connecting and growing and maturing, with each passing year, their risk of lifetime incidence of substance use disorder goes down. So if we can get them to 18, I mean, ideally 21, but if we can get them to 18, we get it back down to 10%, which is sort of where the general population is. But if earlier than that, for example, if a kid starts drinking, for example, in middle school, then their risk is a little bit above 50%. And 90% of people who have substance use disorder in their adulthood report that they started drinking before age 18. So the longer we can push this off, the better.
Okay, Allison Tate says hi to you, Jess, and Dee
Walker
says
Allison.
Hi to everybody. And I don't know why Allison didn't say hi to me also, but okay. Hi, Allison.
Allison's the best. Hello, Allison.
So I want to go back to something you said about having one adult who loves your kid, who supports your kid.
Yeah.
So in that story is something I think that for me always felt like a little bit of relief, because I wasn't always the one for my kid at every particular moment of their lives. But to know that somebody was their person gave me a sense of relief.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of ego that was sad, but more this feeling. So, is that true?
Oh, absolutely. It could be a coach. It could be a teacher. It could be, there's so many people. And what's so interesting to me is, especially after having taught the kids in the rehab, the more I learned about who their person was, and hopefully they had one, for example, the more surprised I was. And the more I realized sometimes those people don't even know that they're the person. It's crazy. This one kid was talking about the fact that he was going to, he was told that if he went through rehab, he could come back and possibly finish high school if he wanted to. And he hadn't decided whether he was going to finish high school or not. And I asked him to write about this. I asked him, we talked about it a lot. And it turns out that there was a teacher that didn't even realize that he was sort of the only one that knew this kid. This kid said, if I go back to high school, it'll be because of this one guy, because no one else will miss me. No one else will even notice if I'm not there, but this guy will notice. And he's the only person who really saw me. And this guy, he was a teacher, but he was like the teacher who sat in on like where they put the rubber room, where they put like the bad kids when they get kicked out of class. And, I just wish that more people realize that they could be the one, they could be that person for a kid out there. And so, be looking for these opportunities to be a good role model and mentor, and to really see kids for who they are.
And I mean, I'll add to that. Like, I've had experiences of volunteering in situations where I don't feel, it's not mutual and it's not feeling so good for me. But I have to keep reminding myself that the goal wasn't a mutual relationship, that
Yeah.
it can mean that something is being given to this person without them
Right.
saying, thank you so much, you've changed my life.
Right. Well, I actually had an experience where someone told me that I was their person in middle school, and I couldn't have been more surprised because I thought we had a little bit of an adversarial relationship. And it turns out that she said I was the person because I held her to a higher standard and she was making some poor decisions. And I was not willing to look the other way when she made those poor decisions. And I held her feet to the fire a little bit and she learned from that. And I was shocked when she told me that because I would have said, I don't think she likes me very much. But there's a really cool thing that happens with teachers is sometimes if we're the ones that the kids can push back against a little bit, that means they trust us. It's sort of like when our kids are about to go off for college and they're really pushing against us. And partially that's sort of their emotional shield and them getting ready to sort of, push us away. But it also means that they trust us to be able to take a little bit of the heat in a way that's developmentally appropriate for them. And that's a place of privilege for me. When an 8th grade kid was leaving middle school and about to head off to a new uncharted territory in high school, we always understood that there was a period in the spring of 8th grade where the kids would really start to push up against us in ways they hadn't before. And I came to learn that that was a good thing because that meant that they trusted me enough to take it when they push back and to show them where the limits were and show them where the respect parameters were and just let them separate a little bit. So sometimes it's going to be those people who, you simply expect a lot of and you expect more from.
And don't get the feedback right away. It's a long game, and it's so
Yeah.
disappointing as a human being not to get the thank yous and oh,
Yep.
you touched me so much. But you get those stories. Okay, so
Yeah. From
someone is
middle school, sometimes it's not for 20 years. It's really interesting.
right.
I'm
Someone
sorry.
is
Someone's
asking
asking.
about their 19-year-old who
Hmm.
tried vaping. Half
Hmm.
of his high school class is trying, and he just got dismissed for a random test.
Hmm.
And I guess he's vaping weed. So is he already addicted to marijuana? Which I'm sure we can't answer that for you right now, but Jessica, go for it.
So if your kid is 19, I can't answer for that for you in terms of, whether or not they're addicted to marijuana, but keep in mind that we're only talking about 10% of the population that has the wiring that I have, which means that I have, if I have that first drink, I really can't control whether or not I'll have 4 or 20. So if kids are going to try stuff and that's sort of part of this picture. And it's the important thing for us is that we don't shut it down and we're like, well, that's it, it's over, you've tried stuff now, it's all gone awry. You talk about the fact that this is something that has happened and that we try to do better next time. And I think especially for someone who's in college, understanding that we're one source of information for them and that helping them understand that their goals in college, some of those goals could be jeopardized if they're messing with, for example, their short-term memory, which is one of the big things that happens with THC, with pot or cannabis, is that it affects the receptors are in the hippocampus or right near the hippocampus, so they affect memory storage, short-term memory. And if you're in college and you got to do a lot of work and you got to memorize a lot of things, it's going to mess with that. So start talking about his goals and how sometimes cannabis use can mess with that, and all substances, obviously.
Okay, so let's go to, you did a lot of research for this book. You've lived a
Mhm.
life. You've taught with kids. If you could distill it down to I know this is the worst, but give us your
No,
very
no.
best advice for parents.
Mhm. Okay, so we're talking about two things here. We're talking about trying to prevent substance use disorder, which is, like I said, about 10% of the population sort of has this propensity. But more than that, we're talking about adolescence. We're talking about trying to protect adolescent brains until they get to the point where they're done developing. And that's not until the early to mid 20s. And so what we need to do is arm kids with as much information, accurate information as possible, put faith in them to make good decisions, and help them understand that the things that they want to do as that they may want to try, that they may want, and these are completely normal. I mean, kids are, sort of wired for risk and wanting to try new things, and adolescents' dopamine levels are lower than they are for kids and adults. So we have to give kids really good information, give them some faith that they can have some faith in them, that they can make good decisions, and then give them as much protection as possible. And protections include things like early intervention for mental health issues, early intervention for academic failure, early intervention for example, kids being aggressive against other kids, and making sure that they have that they're being screened on a regular basis by their healthcare provider for high risk behaviors. And that's sort of at baseline two of the best things we can do for kids.
Okay, so you've taken some negative feedback on an article you just written, which was in The Atlantic. Where did you just write an article? New York Times?
New York Times, Washington Post. I don't know. I haven't read the comments.
Don't bother. But I
hadn't seen any of the negative pushback, so this is going to be news to me.
Well, so one of the things that I think is interesting is a sense that if you follow the prescription that's been put forth, that you can control the outcome. So you don't guarantee an outcome. Nobody can.
Absolutely not.
So let's talk about why, as parents, do we continue to try all the things we can do, despite having to be aware of the fact that it may not get us what we hope to get.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that we as parents need to do is to model what we want to see in our kids, which is I thought I was doing my best. I'm doing my best as I can. And then when I learn stuff, I don't blame my mistakes on something else, on someone else. I don't pretend I didn't make mistakes. I learn from my mistakes and I move forward, incorporating new knowledge that I gained during making that mistake. And when we model that for our kids, that's all that we can ever ask of them. And so that's all I'm doing is, frankly, I wrote this book because I have two kids. I went through substance abuse myself. I would like to protect them as much as possible. And I just wanted to understand what the phrase substance abuse is preventable, which is sort of the party line of all the experts out there. Substance abuse is one of the biggest preventable public health risks out there. And so what does that phrase mean? Like, what can I control? What can't I control? And I say over and over again in the book, I can't control these things. I can just do my best given the best information we have, best scientific information we have, and evidence. That's all I can do.
And truthfully, this is the reason why this book is so good for us just as parents. That's true for everything we do as parents. We don't give up because we can't control the outcome. So this is no different. We're going to do all the things that Jess and everyone else suggests as best we can.
Right. That's all we can ever do.
Right. Okay. So give us some closing parting words.
So the closing parting words, the best way to sort of encapsulate this book is that think of addiction and think of risk and prevention as like an old timey scale, where the more risk factors our kids have, whether that's genetics, whether that's trauma, big T or little t trauma, whether that's adverse childhood experiences, whether that's academic failure, the heavier that risk side is, the more protections we're going to have to heap on them. And in the book, I go through all of the possible protections out there, ones that you sort of hear about in the media and ones that are in the literature. And I looked at all of them to see which ones make sense to include in the book, and then heap as many of those on as you can so that we can get that scale at least to the place where we've got even odds. That's all we can do. And like I said, the other thing is, we have to take a look at ourselves. I didn't really have a shot at helping my kids prevent substance abuse in my kids as much as I could, unless I was sort of dealing with my own issues. And that can be the hardest part of this whole picture, is that many of us have an unhealthy relationship with drugs and alcohol. And okay, so what do we do next? Well, how do we try to do better for ourselves and our kids? And that's, as you put it so lovely, that's, really all we can do is do our best.
Jess Lahey, hold up your book one more time so everyone can see it. The Addiction Inoculation, Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence, out today. Everyone get your copy. Thanks so much, Jess Lahey.
Thank you so much.